the imagination helps us to see the world in new ways, and as such it is often a reasonable statement on things. It is something that can be understood and thought about philosophically, theologically. It is not immune to reason, but nor does it follow the confines of conventional thought. And in a sense, there's no way of thinking reasonably about the world without thinking imaginatively about the world, because we always have to see the world in new ways.
Theology and the arts have a lot of overlap. Both of them are about ways of envisioning the world as it is and how it might be. They look at being wounded, they look at healing, they look at redemption, they look at the ultimate, they look at meaning, sometimes in different ways, sometimes in overlapping ways. So the conversation between artists and theologians can be just very wonderful.
At the center, one of the things we like to say about ourselves is that we like to get people talking more than we like to talk ourselves. So anytime we can create an occasion for people to gather and reflect on an issue of common concern, we're really interested in doing that.
Art Talks at the Institute for Christian Studies has been a long-standing project that's meant to bring reflection about the relationship between art and religion to the general public. And that's been its mandate since the very beginning.
This was a particularly fascinating and wonderful event. It brought together theoreticians and practitioners in arts and people who were all very interested and involved in theological and religious things. Some of them as believers and some of them not as believers.
I think the title of the conference was very clever in this regard, Imagination's Truths. Because traditionally, philosophy would see imagination as having to do with some form of untruth, some form of non-reality. So to actually provoke the question of what the imagination has to do with truth is a challenge to philosophy traditionally understood. And I think Carney's talks, and especially his contribution at the panel, was, if memory serves, very good at bringing out that tension.
When I mentioned Plato denouncing imagination as the first philosophical statement ever made in Western thought and theory about fantasia and eikasia, the two Greek words for imagination. It's because that's what people felt, that imagination misleads us, it distorts truth, it's a denial, it's an escapism, it's mendacity. So that Aristotle had to come along and say, well, hang on, Plato, I love you, you're a great teacher, but you're forgetting something. Imagination can also, through the process of creative imitation and implotment, bring out the meaning of things and of facts in a way that no historian, no empirical recounter of mere events can ever do. So one has to struggle for the positive sense of imagination. It's not self-evident at all.
I directed the evening portion of Imagination's Truth. That consisted of two parts. One was a public reading of a selected plays from 66 books, and the other half was a piece that I wrote myself and performed called Subway Stations of the Cross. I hope to ignite people's sensibilities to the spiritual, or to question again, to re-question their questionings, their doubts, to challenge them. So that's kind of like the line that I walk, and hopefully I do both. And by doing both, if nobody comes to my shows, then all right, that's so be it.
If imagination and creativity are not just things that you do, you see different use for this or that, you see new possibilities. That's true, that's important, but also seeing that the reason I'm already using this in this way, it's because of someone else's imagination. The world has already been imagined for me, and I take it for granted, I take it as natural, but it's people have been imagining since the beginning of time. That's the reason we're here. Imagination doesn't start now, it's begun long before us, and it'll keep continuing.
What we have valued as truth knowledge has changed over the centuries. We're in a time period where What we really value is, some kind of verifiable truth, which we associate with science, which we associate with reason, which we associate with what we see and what we experience in some kind of empirical way. But the imagination has access, in fact, it's our only access to other kinds of truth, which are truths that actually can't be proved in the scientific way, or quote scientific way. So that kind of truth, in fact, when we start to imagine, about some kind of meaning beyond, our everyday life, then the imagination becomes very essential, because it's the only way we can think about notions like God, or even notions like justice.
The story that we tell about the world is a story that is not finished, that is not yet complete. If we think about Scripture and the kind of Protestant reading of 66 books in the Bible, they tell the story of the world, and yet that world is not yet over, it's not yet finished. There is a kind of always to be continued, which is where the church takes up its role of trying to imagine what that might mean and what that might look like. So the story of theology, while it does have certain beliefs that it is very committed to, rightly committed to, is always an open-ended story. I think understanding theology that way allows it to have a much easier relationship with the imagination. They are sometimes in conflict, sometimes rightly in conflict, but it's much easier to reconcile them if we think theologically in that way.